book 6. Okay. I'm not.
Oh, not yet?
Okay. Today I want to talk a little bit about Roman culture, which in many ways is derivative from Greek culture. And the Romans were concerned with practicality. And if the Greeks, I might call a scientific people, the Romans were a people who were devoted to engineering. In other words, the big Roman question is a question that was focused on by Aristotle. Will it work in practice? So the Romans took Greek ideas and made them bigger and sturdier and less evanescent. The Romans were concerned to build forever. If you've ever gotten a chance to see Vitruvius's work on architecture, that's the kind of thing the Romans are very good at. Now, today I want to talk about the connection between Greek and Roman culture. And here I want to focus on Polybius, the historian who wrote in Greek in the 2nd century BC. And he's lived through the outcome of the Punic Wars. In other words, once Rome defeats Carthage finally, they are able to mop up the rest of the Mediterranean Sea, which means the Balkans and Greece and the Near East and Egypt and North Africa. So the Romans are on a roll. They're at the height of their republic. And what Polybius wants to know is, how did they do that? In other words, here's the kind of thing that you can't help but step back and say, look, many regimes have looked for this kind of power, but only one has achieved it. And how has it lasted? I mean, in the case of Alexander the Great, there was a short period of empire building, but the Romans seem to have gotten it down to a science. And he looks back, Polybius, to Aristotle's categories in order to make sense of what the Romans are doing right. And if you remember, Aristotle had the one, the few, and the many, and then he had good examples and bad examples. The good examples of the one, the few, and the many sought the common good. That's kingship, aristocracy, and mixed polity. The bad forms of the same categories seek only a private or partial or factional good, and that would be tyranny or oligarchy or something like mob rule. It's not truly democracy. There's a Greek term for it, ochlocracy. All right. What Polybius does, and this is a fascinating thought for a historian, is he adds time to Aristotle's categories. And he says, the problem with Aristotle is that these seem to be fixed and ahistorical. But because he thinks like a historian, he says, is there an order to these? Is it possible that there's a structure or a pattern to the way in which regimes move from one to the other, to the way in which they decline and turn from one thing into another? And he actually comes up with an idea which is consistent with the cyclical view of history that we saw in Thucydides when we read the Peloponnesian War. But the cyclical view of history that Polybius has is based upon setting Aristotle's categories in motion through time. So he says political order is natural. And the first kind of political order, and this is from the State of Nature, this is a very sophisticated argument. The first kind of political order will be something like a primitive kingship. The biggest and strongest alpha male, somebody like Achilles, will say, I'm the boss now, and kill anyone that denies it. He says that's in some ways a pre-political state. But sooner or later, this primitive kingship will result in legitimate monarchy. And legitimate monarchy is the proper rule of the one, but with the intention of achieving the common good and relying upon the rule of law. So monarchy emerges from primitive chieftainship or kingship. Now, the problem with monarchy is that, like all human things, sooner or later it declines. And tyranny is eventually the result. Eventually you get a king who's a king in name only because he does not pursue the common good. This will naturally generate anger among the best portion of the population, and eventually the tyranny will be destroyed, and what will take its place is an aristocracy, which took the power away from the bad form of monarchy. But the cycle continues. Sooner or later, that same aristocracy, however virtuous and public-spirited to begin with, is going to eventually become self-interested and transform itself gradually into an oligarchy. And that oligarchy will be pursuing the interests of the rich that make up the party rather than the entirety of society. So they will be the bad form of aristocracy. Now, when the bad form of aristocracy emerges, sooner or later, the people themselves rise up and they institute what you might call a polity, an attempt to create a good, a virtuous version of democracy. Not one that's pure popular will, because that ends up being mob rule, but one in which the various elements of society, the one, the few, and the many, according to Aristotle, find a balance. And that's what happens when we get a properly functioning polity. So of all the 6 different regimes, there's monarchy and tyranny, aristocracy and oligarchy, and democracy and mob rule. The best of them, the most lasting, is the mixed polity. Now, ochlocracy, you might think that was the end of the line, but no. Once you get mob rule, you get the state of all, war of all against all, like Hobbes talked about. What you're going to get there then is the rise of one superior warrior. So the entire cycle begins again. That's called anacyclosis. It's the cycle of history. And it comes from human nature and from the constraints which nature puts on us. So what Polybius is talking about is something very much like natural law. People naturally have a sense of justice when they see behavior like the disrespect of parents or disrespect of elders. And that's why it's a sort of universal value, why it's seen everywhere. And when he looks at the Roman Empire, he's a Greek looking at the Roman Empire, not Empire, the Roman Republic, but in its imperial expansionist phase when it took over the whole Mediterranean. When Polybius looks at that, he is a Greek-educated scholar who's looking at something prodigious. These guys got politics right. So what he's trying to do in his 40-volume history is explain why Greece fell, and fell quickly and easily to the Romans. But Rome has not only expanded, but prospered, taken over everything in sight, and is now a dominant power, and it looks to be so for a very long period of time. How did the Romans succeed in doing that? And what he says is, Aristotle was right. The most stable kind of regime is a mixed polity, and the Romans have done that. They have something like elective monarchs called consuls. 2 of them are elected every year, and it's only a year-long elective monarchy, although consuls can rule for multiple years if they're elected. So what we have here is a selection of executives from the patrician class, all right? The second part, the rule of the few, is found in the best families, the richest families in Rome, and the richest families were often military families, and we're talking about enormous amounts of wealth in both land and slaves. Always remember that Rome is a predatory military entity, and it had to expand or die, and it survived only on slave labor. So that's going to be crucially important in the development of Roman politics. But the plebs, well, the patricians are in the Senate, and the plebeians have the tribunes. That's a select group of individuals who speak on behalf of the interests of the common people who are not admitted to the Senate and not eligible to be consuls. So these spokesmen for the plebs do a pretty good job of balancing things out, of making sure that taxes aren't excessive, that requisitions of land or property are properly paid for, that people aren't jailed by or harmed by rich enemies without justification. So what he has here, what Rome has here in its Republican expansionist phase, is a carefully balanced polity. And that's why it managed to last so long and hold together the various portions of society. You have the rich, you have the poor, hopefully you have the consuls wisely balancing between them on a day-to-day basis. And then you have the Senate and the tribunes who find a way to negotiate their political issues. So the Roman constitution is a mixed constitution, and they got the right recipe for balance. This has been enormously influential in political theory. One way of thinking about it would be say that Hobbes adopts the idea of anacyclosis, but simplifies it. Instead of having six different possibilities, 3 good regimes, 3 bad regimes, Hobbes has 2 possibilities: any regime and no regime. He says under no regime, in the state of anarchy, you're exposed to every possible evil and every possible hazard. So whatever regime you have, that's the one you should keep. Polybius is a bit more demanding from a regime. He distinguishes between good and bad regimes in the way that that Hobbes does not. In a way, you can see Polybius as completing the Aristotelian project of looking at political systems on the basis of their constitution and treating them naturalistically. They're phenomena in the world. And we see different sorts of regimes all around. So somehow it must be produced by nature. And if it's produced by nature, why do we see this plurality of different kinds of regime? And the answer is because everybody's embroiled in this cycle of political revolution. And the most successful societies are the ones that manage to avoid revolution. And they avoid revolution by finding that harmonious balance between the rich and the poor and the various other pressure or the various other groups that make up the foundational elements of a society. Polybius was very much part of the background for both the English Revolution and the American Revolution and the French Revolution. All of the men that made those revolutions were deeply versed in Roman history, and each of them was responding in their own way to Polybius's strictures. In the English and American revolutions, we have bicameral legislatures that represent the people and something else. On the other hand, the French revolutionaries were explicitly rejecting Polybius, saying the only thing we need represented is the people itself. And that leads to the tradition of unicameral legislatures. So Polybius then is a very optimistic and impressed outsider looking at the Roman Republic as it comes to dominate the Mediterranean. And he's trying to draw conclusions that will allow the makers of constitutions in the future to find the most settled and stable, which avoids the downside, the miseries of the bad regimes, which would be tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule. No one that with any sense, with any reason wants that. So to find a stable balance in a government is a crucially important idea. Now, I'll finish with this. one of the sad things about being a historian and reading the history of philosophy or the history of thought, um, the history of high culture is lacking many things. We only have 5 of the 40 volumes of Polybius. The other 35 have been lost, which is a very sad thing. I've just been giving you a section of book 6, which is perhaps the most famous, but we even only have fragments of that. So imagine how much more brilliance there was in a writer like this, and how many more considerations we have lost. I'm glad that it's a felony to do harm to other people. I am tempted to want to make it a felony to do harm to books. If you think about, say, the destruction of Baghdad and the House of Wisdom and the enormous number of manuscripts there, it was destroyed by the Mongols in 1285. And that's one of the saddest days in human history. And one of the sadnesses that someone who loves books like me, or who eats books like me, has, is that there aren't more of them, and that we're missing some of them. And also, upon reflection, I'd like to add that we owe a great debt to the anonymous scribes and bibliophiles and holy men who transcribed ancient books in the hope that their posterity would gain from them. I thank whoever it is that copied Polybius and gave us this. I wish there had been 7 times more so we could have gotten the entire book. Now, Roman culture focuses on practical questions for the most part. They are not a theoretical people in the sense that the Greeks were, but they had a great sense of humor, and satire is something that the Romans are good at. And if you ever get a chance, I would recommend that you read Horace and Juvenal, because they are rippingly funny, and they have nasty they have a kind of nasty sense of humor. Horace is an okay guy. He's not as harsh, but Juvenal is really tough. And satire is often connected with skepticism. And that's one of the 3 main branches of Roman philosophy. After the death of Socrates, or the passing of the polis because of Alexander the Great, in the Hellenistic period, 3 main kinds of philosophy fragmented off the Socratic tradition. And one of them was Stoicism, and I've already talked about that. And another one was Epicureanism, which is a kind of rational pleasure seeking, moderate pleasure seeking in the absence of pain. And the third one, which is very typically Roman, is skepticism. And think of how easy it would be to be a skeptic in ancient Rome. Lucian, who's my favorite skeptic, is living in the 2nd century AD, and he has been bombarded by so many philosophies and so many religions and so many cults and so many mythologies that you never know which to choose. You get in some ways it's like the internet. The problem is like trying to drink from a fire hose. We're getting too much information. It was much easier when the polis was restricted to the state religion and you had a common set of myths with everyone else. So Lucian the skeptic wrote some very funny parodies of Platonic dialogues. And look, however much I like Plato, you have to have a sense of humor about it. Remember back in the Gorgias when Callicles asks, is Socrates joking or is he serious? You have to undo that distinction. Socrates is joking and he's serious. Well, a great playfulness and a great seriousness are not incompatible. And that's what I like with Lucian the skeptic. He's doing a send-up of the Platonic dialogues. And however much I admire them and respect them and wish that there were more of them, they are so serious and so deep that I can see that they're an apt target for a skeptical, joking parody. So what happens is in Philosophies for Sale, the philosophies are embodied by their actual advocates, the ones who thought them up. And we're at a Roman slave market. So the philosophers themselves are being offered for sale as slaves to rich Romans. All right. Well, Zeus, the head of the pantheon, is selling philosophers in a slave market. And the idea is to show the most bizarre and peculiar elements in each philosophy. And what Lucian is doing is saying, look, every one of these belief systems requires us to believe something that's highly improbable and at best very uncertain. So the first up is Pythagoras. And Pythagoras, if you remember from reading of pre-Socratic philosophers, Pythagoras created a kind of religion around numbers. So his followers created a sort of monastery, a kind of religious environment in which they did mathematical problems because they had decided that everything was made of math. Now, in many ways, this is a brilliant idea. But however important math may be in the Western intellectual tradition, there's lots of stuff that Pythagoras believed and insisted on that is an easy mark for satire. For example, he was a vegetarian and insisted that all Pythagoreans refrain from eating meat. And the reason why is because he had come up with the idea of reincarnation. Pythagoras believed that souls were not destroyed after death, that in fact they entered new living bodies, and they could be human bodies or they could be animal bodies. And so in order to prevent unintentionally eating your own parents, provided they're deceased, you must refrain from meat entirely because it could be a kind of cannibalism. So this kind of weird idea is built into the mathematical religion of Pythagoras. And so when Pythagoras tries to explain himself to a prospective buyer, nobody's as impressed with him as he is. And many of the ideas cause regular Romans to look at each other in amazement. So the idea is the ordinary Roman is going to look at the tradition that comes from Greece in philosophy, wondering how could anybody have ever gotten themselves to believe stuff like that? And Pythagoras is one of the more presentable of the bunch. The second, is Diogenes the Cynic. Now, cynicism is a rejection of value in this world. And since there's nothing valuable and no conventions are worth observing, what he recommends a prospective buyer do is that he get rid of his family, throw all his money into the ocean, and then live naked and beg food and masturbate whenever he wants to. This was the successful cynical wise man, and Diogenes is the one who, it was said, was asked by Alexander the Great, "What can I do for you?" And he was the one that replied, "You're in my light." So this is a desperate rejection of all things human. And cynicism appeals to the jaded and the hurt, the kind of wounded birds among us. But as a philosophy, its attraction lies mainly in the things that it treats as repulsive. So there is a kind of sadness to Diogenes, and he gets bought like Pythagoras, but not for as much as he had hoped, because he had hoped it would be for nothing. Get rid of your money, get rid of your family, get rid of your life. Next, we have two philosophers that are brought up at the same time. One is a Cyrenaic, and what that is a straightforward heroism. rather straightforward hedonism. And hedonism is the argument that, and the belief that pleasure is what's good, and what you want to do is accumulate as much pleasure without any discrimination and without any moderation. The other figure that gets brought up is Democritus. And Democritus also remains unsold, along with Heraclitus. So eventually the Cyrenaic is sold, and for a good price, because he sounds like a party animal. It's easy to get a Roman to say, well, that's a philosophy for me. Let's have fun. And so he goes for a large price. The more circumspect, like Democritus, who is an atomist, and Heraclitus, who said everything is change, they don't get sold because it doesn't appeal to any of the Roman slave buyers. If you remember Socrates, well, Socrates himself gets sold here, and he's a marker for the whole Socratic and Platonic tradition. He gets bought, this is actually a jibe at Plato, he gets bought by Dion of Syracuse. And Dion of Syracuse was the tyrant that Plato of Sicily, that Plato in his Wanderjahre, in his time abroad, he went to Sicily at Dion's request, and he tried to teach Dion philosophy. And Dion initially liked the idea of being a philosopher king, but quickly grew tired of it and wasn't interested in geometry, and Plato ended up in jail. So he was imprisoned. He eventually got out, but the idea of having Dion of Syracuse by Socrates is a slap at the impracticality of Platonism. Said, fine, you're going to try it again? We already know what Socratic philosophy does when it's actually employed by a tyrant. It makes the tyrant even worse because he won't study philosophy, and the philosopher will end up in jail. So this is a reflection of the practicality of Roman thought. Romans like things that work, things that are stable, and then and only then are they going to be concerned with conceptual beauty or apparent beauty. Now, after Socrates gets sold to Dion, Epicurus comes out, and Epicurus is the founder of a philosophy which says that what's good is what's pleasant. Pleasure is the good. So he halfway agrees with the hedonists, but then he says one must pursue pleasure in a rational, moderate fashion so as to avoid any corresponding pain. So the hedonist will drink the whole bottle of vodka. The Epicurean has 2 drinks and then says that's enough because he doesn't want to wake up with a hangover in the morning. So if you can imagine a more rational version of hedonism in Epicureanism, and that also sounds like not a raucous party, but a restrained, quiet absorption of small pleasures, and a circumstance in which nothing around you causes you any pain. It's perhaps attractive to aesthetes, and he also manages to get sold. But right after him, to show the disparate nature of Greek philosophy or the Greek tradition, we get Stoicism. And here we get Chrysippus, who's one of the founders of Stoicism during the Hellenistic period. And the harsh brutality, the disdain for feeling, the inhuman qualities of Stoicism are what comes out. And Chrysippus is battle tested, and he tells his possible buyers that he will help organize and discipline their lives, and they can be as organized and disciplined as him. And thereafter, they will have infinite tranquility so long as they are constantly on their guard to pursue virtue. So it's what we might call a very strenuous sort of happiness. others that dispute that Stoicism or Epicureanism or Pythagoreanism. The next would be the Peripatetics. These are the walking philosophers. Days when I could still walk well, I used to be a peripatetic philosopher too. Used to walk around in a classroom and say what came into my head. And the Peripatetics held up the Aristotelian tradition of empiricism and naturalism and the necessity of practical knowledge. That's knowledge that's not perfectly accurate, that's approximate. So Aristotle is the kind of thinker that was much more likely to appeal to the Roman psyche than Plato would, or Socrates would. Aristotle is concerned with getting things done in this world and making sure that they work right. And he isn't interested in creating ideals or ideal governments, but rather he wants to look at how governments really work, learn from history, learn from other people's mistakes, which prospers and remains stable over an extended period of time. So Aristotle is a very important influence on all of Hellenistic thought, and it's actually proper that he should be. Now, finishing up the last of our players, we have the skeptic Pyrrho. And Pyrrhonic skepticism is a belief that there's not much of anything in the world that can be certain. And for that reason, we are obligated to suspend judgment if we're going to be rational. Christians say one thing, but the followers of Mithras or Isis say something else. How can we judge between than the Stoics or the Epicureans? Each of these philosophies would take a lifetime to properly investigate. And so, since we only have one lifetime, anyone who says that they're certain that their philosophy is the best is actually operating under the realm of self-deception. It's not possible to know such a thing. And the best we can do is maintain a kind of haughty distance from theorizing of all kinds and look to practical activities as offering us something better. And Lucian, for all his skepticism, and there's a touch of cynicism in Lucian too, he's one of the Romans that had a congenial sense of humor. And if you like Roman satire, as nearly everybody does, you couldn't and in which everyone is far more disorderly and far more unphilosophical than in Plato's real symposium. So you enjoy Lucian. I think there's lots to learn from him, and there's lots to enjoy there. Polybius, that's going to require more serious, extended thought, because the idea of a cyclical nature to political life is history, where we go from a beginning to a middle to an end. If Anacyclosis is right, progress isn't possible. And that's why the ancients didn't think about progress. It's a characteristically modern idea. How's that?